All right, welcome back. Let's continue to talk about attitudes, but this time let's focus on persuasion that occurs via our own actions. We call that self-persuasion. Remember, the link between attitudes and behaviors is pretty obvious in that attitudes do influence our behaviors. Think about your own life. I assume that you have a positive attitude about personal growth and about education, and that's why you engage in behaviors like going to college. But we need to keep in mind that our behaviors can change our attitudes as well. In other words, the link is bidirectional. Let me give you an example of what I mean when I say that behaviors can change our attitudes. Many years ago, Ohio enacted a law that stated that you had to wear a seatbelt when you were driving your car. And at that point, for whatever reason, I didn't think it was important to wear a seatbelt. So after a while, I started getting some tickets. And one way to avoid paying for those tickets was to go to a driver's education class where they would teach you about the importance of wearing a seatbelt. And during that class, I learned some information. One key piece of information that I already knew was that if you don't wear a seatbelt, you could injure yourself. Now, one piece of information that I did not think about that I learned was that if you don't wear a seatbelt, you of course become a projectile and there are other people in the car. So if you become a projectile, you might hurt someone else in the car. So that was really a new piece of information for me. I hadn't thought of that. And keep in mind, of course, a lot of us carry some very precious cargo. So one take-home message was you should wear a seatbelt, not just to protect yourself, but you need to wear a seatbelt to protect other people in the car. So in this situation, a new law forced me to play a new role, the role of seatbelt user, and that was new for me. I was completely against it at first, but as a result of my behavior, and then as a result of actually wearing a seatbelt and experiencing life as a seatbelt user, my attitude really did change. And now I would never consider driving without one. It's really pretty interesting. Researchers have found that attitude change, otherwise known as persuasion, will persist longer when it's been inspired by our own behaviors. And that's because when we play a new role, we're forced to learn and remember key persuasive messages. So in this situation, every time that I put on that seatbelt, and remember at first I really didn't want to, I was reminded that I'm putting on this seatbelt because I need to help myself, and I'm also putting on this seatbelt because I need to be safe for other people who are in my car. And keep this in mind. We also experience the consequences of our new actions firsthand. So when I'm driving my car and I'm belted in, and I have a green light and someone comes out in front of me, and then I slam on those brakes, as my body's moving forward and the seatbelt catches me, I realize, wow, this is actually a pretty good thing. So in other words, I'm rewarded by the consequences of those actions. And each time I'm rewarded for wearing that seatbelt, that strengthens my new attitude, my new positive attitude towards seatbelt use. Well, how can our behaviors lead to changes in our attitudes? How does it work? To some extent, it's all about mental gymnastics. Cognitive dissonance theory states that behavioral and cognitive inconsistencies will create a psychological tension. That tension is also known as dissonance. Well, we don't like that feeling of tension, so we're motivated to reduce it. And one way that we can reduce that tension is by changing our attitudes so that our attitudes are consistent with our behaviors. So I'm about to walk through an example to make that more clear for you, but the bottom line is one way that we can deal with this tension that's caused by an inconsistency between our attitudes and our behaviors is to change our attitude so that it's more in line with our behavior. So consider this poor guy right here. He's a recruit for a fraternity, and he's going through some hazing. And let's just assume that this is true. Maybe he really wasn't all that interested in this fraternity in the first place. Maybe he had some other friends who also wanted to become members. So he went along. He thought it was a good idea, but it's not like he was so gung-ho. And now he finds himself in this situation. He's out there on the college green, he's tied up to a post, and there's a sprinkler spraying water right in his face. And now he's thinking to himself, I never really thought this fraternity was such a big deal. It wasn't so important to me. But now look at what I'm actually doing. Look at my behavior. I'm engaging in a behavior that makes it seem like this fraternity is really important to me because I'm going through this because I want to be a member. Because there's this inconsistency between his attitude and his behavior, it creates this psychological tension, and he's motivated to reduce that. In this case, by enduring such extreme hazing, this particular recruit is likely to value that fraternity more than he did before, so his attitude and his behavior will become more consistent. Let's go through one more example. Maybe you'll be able to relate to this one a little bit better. Let's say you have an attitude that states, I need to go on a diet because I need to change the way that I look and the way that I feel. But then you find yourself in the middle of eating chocolate fudge ice cream. That behavior is very inconsistent with your attitude about losing weight. So of course that's going to create some type of tension. That's going to create cognitive dissonance. And we need to do something to reduce that dissonance because it doesn't feel good when we're engaging in a behavior that's very inconsistent with our attitude. So one thing that people will do is change their attitude. And in this case, you might change your attitude such that you start to think, well, maybe I don't really need to be on a diet. I look great as it is. There are a lot of people who are a little bit overweight. That's the new normal in today's society. So that would be an example of how cognitive dissonance and inner tension can lead to a change in your attitude such that your attitude is now consistent with your behavior. Now that said, there are some other mental gymnastics that can help reduce that tension, that cognitive dissonance that's created by the discrepancy between your attitudes and your behavior. And some other examples are listed in this table. Let's talk about some research on cognitive dissonance theory. In fact, much of cognitive dissonance theory is based on this classic research. We're going to see as we explain this basic finding that cognitive dissonance and attitude change are most likely to occur when there's an insufficient justification for us to explain our attitude discrepant behaviors. Social psychologists have been talking about cognitive research for decades, and it all started for the most part when Fessinger and Carl Smith published a research study in 1959. And in this study, there were 3 groups of people. And initially, they all engaged in the same task. And the task was really boring. They were turning pegs on a pegboard. They were given some reasons as to why they were doing this. But overall, the study was relatively inconsequential to them and boring. It was not the type of thing you would want to spend an afternoon doing. Now, just like in many social psychological research studies, that was just the basic setup. It was at this point that things got really interesting. So imagine that in this study, there were 3 groups of people. In one group, as the subjects were leaving the study, they encountered a student who was waiting. And the researchers told them to tell that student who was waiting what they thought about the study. And because the study was boring, they told the students who were waiting that the study was boring. In another group of people, when they were leaving the study, they were told to lie to that person who was waiting because they didn't want the person to leave. They wanted the person to think that the study was going to be interesting, and they were paid $20 to do this. Now keep in mind, this was in 1959, and in 1959, $20 was really quite a bit of money. It might be like $80 or $100 today, somewhere in that area. So they were told to lie to these people and tell them, hey, it was really an interesting study. That third group of people, when they left the research study and they encountered the student who was waiting, they were also told to lie about the study. They were told to say that it was a very interesting research study, yet they were only paid $1. Now, all of the students who were involved in the research study, later on they were asked, how much did you actually enjoy the study? What was your actual attitude? Well, the results were fascinating, and they've been the topic of debate for decades since. The people who didn't lie, the people who told the student who was waiting that the study was boring, they thought the study was pretty boring when they were asked to rate how much they enjoyed the study. When they asked the people who were paid $20 what they thought about the study, in general they thought it was pretty boring as well. Now in this case you might assume that there was some type of tension between their attitude of the study, how much they enjoyed it, and their behavior, what they actually told that student who was waiting. They told that student that they really liked the study. But in this case, there really wasn't much tension because there was sufficient justification for them lying. And they said to themselves, hey, I was paid $20 to lie. That's why I lied. The people who were paid $1 to lie were in a very different situation. Just like everybody else in the study, they thought truthfully that the study was boring. Yet remember, they lied to those subjects who were waiting, and they told them that it was a fun study, that it was really interesting. Now, in this situation, that created some tension because they were only paid $1 to lie, and that's not really a sufficient excuse to lie to someone. So because they had this tension, one way that they dealt with that was by changing their attitude about the task. And when they were asked how much they enjoyed the task, they actually listed the task as relatively enjoyable. So just to sum things up, $20 is a sufficient justification for most people to lie, but $1 is not. And that's why the subjects in the $1 condition change their attitudes about the task to reduce their dissonance. Okay, with that in mind, let's discuss some alternative routes to self-persuasion. It's true that people often change their behaviors after they behave in ways that are inconsistent with their existing attitudes. That's the basis for what we've been talking about. That's the basis for self-persuasion. We change our attitudes to be consistent with the behaviors that we've engaged in. But not everybody agrees that cognitive dissonance theory provides the best explanation for why our attitudes often change so that they're in line with our behaviors. What we're going to do next is discuss 3 other explanations that have been tested. Each one provides at least some supportive evidence, and that suggests that our behaviors influence our attitudes in a variety of different ways. We'll talk about these 3 theories, and along the way we'll walk through this example and see how each theory would explain attitude change via self-persuasion. According to self-perception theory, we infer our own attitudes by observing ourselves and our own behavior just like other people would do. So in this situation, we would look at that kid and we would say, wow, he must really want to be a part of that fraternity because look at what he's going through. Well, the whole point of self-perception theory is that he's doing the same thing. As he's sitting there getting sprayed with water, he's thinking to himself, wow, I must really want to be a part of this fraternity because look at what I'm going through. So do you see how, according to self-perception theory, cognitive dissonance isn't necessary, that inner tension isn't necessary? In this situation, his attitude is conforming to his behavior simply because he's looking at his behavior and he's trying to determine what his attitude is by examining his own behavior. According to impression management theory, we're not necessarily motivated to have a consistency between our attitudes and our behaviors, like cognitive dissonance theory would expect. But we are motivated to appear consistent to others. So in this situation, if that kid's not really gung-ho about that fraternity, yet he engages in these behaviors, that's going to look pretty strange to people like us who are looking on. So he does want to appear consistent. So in this situation, he would say, yeah, I love that fraternity. I would do anything for it. So do you see how in this situation, he might change the attitude that he shares with us, but he's not necessarily changing his true attitude? That's what makes impression management theory different. And as I said, there are different theories to help explain these results. The final set of theories that I wanted to talk about were theories that were related to self-esteem. And according to these theories, discrepancies between our attitudes and our behaviors threaten our self-concept. And that can make us feel guilty. It can make us feel dishonest. It can make us feel hypocritical. In this case, it would probably make him feel like a fool. So according to this theory, to repair his self-esteem, he would have to change his attitude about the fraternity. So he would come to like the fraternity more. This table right here does a good job of comparing the different theories and what they would expect. Well, that's it for this section, but stay tuned because there's more social psychology coming up soon.